Welcome to another episode of We Don't Die. I'm your host, Sandra Champlain, author of the best-selling book called We Don't Die: A Skeptic's Discovery of Life After Death. And just a reminder, my home base is wedon'tdie.com, where you can find the nearly 800 podcast episodes I have on this subject. Also, we offer a free Sunday gathering inspirational service with medium demonstration. And if you don't have a copy of my book and would like a free PDF copy, just enter your name and email address at the bottom of the main page there at wedon'tdie.com. It says you get the first few chapters. The secret is it's the whole book, because chapter 10, I think, is one of the most important about grief. That being said, today we're going to move on to meeting our guest. Today we're joined by the wonderful Dr. Jan Canty, a psychologist with over 40 years of experience, as well as an author, speaker, and passionate advocate for homicide survivors. She, for 6 years, hosted the podcast Domino Effect of Murder, sharing the stories of those whose lives were reshaped by violent loss. In 1985, Dr. Canty's life pivoted during an evening that changed everything, a moment that defied her scientific training and logic. It turned out to be tragically accurate. For over 30 years, she kept this experience a secret, fearing judgment from her scientific peers. But that changed when her own podcast guests began whispering their own similar stories to her. This inspired her to finally bridge the gap between her clinical background and the spiritual reality of grief, leading to her powerful new book called Rekindled: Healing Grief Through the Science and Experience of After Death Communication. She's here today to share her story, and you may visit her website at jancantyphd.com. Dr. Jan Canty, welcome to We Don't Die.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate that very succinct and accurate summary. You hit on all the high notes.
Well, I hit on the notes, but yours is the story to tell. Tell us a little bit about you, your past, and what brought you into psychology, maybe, and then what happened.
I think in a way I was almost destined to be a psychologist. I come from a very stable, happy, middle-class family. Unlike a lot of people whose stories I hear about, I wouldn't have changed my childhood for anybody's. I had wonderful parents. My mom was very outgoing, extroverted, funny, artistic. People loved her. She knew where to draw boundaries, and she just was a free soul. My dad was very scientific. He loved to read. He liked logic. He liked schedules and discipline. And you kind of put the two together and they kind of make up the backbone of psychology. But no one in my family had been to college. I was the first one to go. And I wasn't even sure I was going to like it because I really hated high school. But I found out I loved college. And then I thought, well, why not get a master's degree? Well, why not get a doctoral? Why not get a postdoc? And before I know it, I was 29 years old when I finally finished. But I love my work. I'm still working at age 74 in the field, and I would choose it all over again. I really would. I think it's a privilege when people let you in and are honest with you and share parts of their lives that are really vulnerable. I take that as a real honor. And
Did
that
you?
extended to my podcast too.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that as well. Did you have any belief in the afterlife or any inclination that perhaps your life would go this direction, sharing this topic?
None whatsoever. It was like I was broadsided. I was, if anything, my training drummed it out of me. Because as you probably can gather, if you're studying psychology, you are reductionistic and you have to have demonstrative methods for everything you do and justify it with statistics, which is why we had to learn statistics, which I hated. But if anything, it pulled me away. And so when that night came that I had an ADC, I had no frame of reference for it whatsoever. And I was 38. And so I did what most people do. I buried it. I disowned it. I put it away and locked the door.
Could you
Never
tell us what
discussed it.
happened?
It was the night that my husband did not come home. It was in July of 1985. and he was very punctual. So it was unlike him not to come home. And because it was 1985, it was before cell phones and internet and all of that. And I was living in Detroit, and it was a raging storm outside that night. We had an unusual hailstorm and high winds and rain, really violent for a summer night. At any rate, our last conversation was at 3 in the afternoon. He said, I'll see you at 7 for dinner. And I said, fine. But 7 came and went, and then 8 o'clock, and then 10 o'clock. And by 11 o'clock, I was frantic. And I just assumed for a while it was the weather that kept him. And I started pacing. I'd made all the usual phone calls, nothing came of them. And I paced into his home office. It's a very old house, and it had an attached bathroom. And I looked in the mirror and I said out loud, he's not coming home. He's dead. And as soon as I said those words, I stopped because it was like not my, it was my voice, but it wasn't my thoughts. And I'm like, what an awful thing to think or say. And I just shut it down. I just thought, oh, that's just stress. And I put that away and did not tell a soul for 30 years. But it turned out to be true. It was in a matter of 10 days that they found his body. And I was called down to police headquarters. And so, as it turns out, doing the math, looking backwards, at the time I had that, what I call moment in the mirror, he'd been dead about 4 hours. And it turned out to be pretty predictive of what happened, even though I had no idea, nothing to base it on concretely at the time.
So that is an after death communication, that voice speaking
Yeah.
through you, and it wasn't your thoughts.
Mm-mm. It was not. I didn't want it to be true. I had no, I mean, I didn't know a soul who'd ever had anybody murdered. It was such a out of norm experience. And I thought, who would even understand this? It certainly was riveting. It was something I never forgot in the sense of amnesia or anything like that. It was always tucked in the back of my mind, always. And I never told anybody for fear of being misunderstood or have it reinterpreted. I didn't want to be told I was crazy. I didn't want anybody to dilute it. So I just put it away and just locked it up. But what unlocked it was my podcast guests, because over time, they volunteered this information. I never asked. I was too uncomfortable with it. It was too alien to my training. But when they volunteered it, at first I just thought, well, that's interesting. Second time I thought, oh, that reminds me of what the other guest said. The third time I thought, this is more than a coincidence. And by the fourth time somebody brought it up, I thought, I've got to look into this. I can't dismiss it. I have to look into it. And alongside that, I kept thinking, if this many guests are bringing it up voluntarily, how many of them would bring it up if I only asked? That was an eye opener. So I started asking, and almost to a person, oh, yeah. And they'd start talking about it. And I just started reading everything I could get my hands on, which led me to Dr. Penberthy at the University of Virginia, Department of Perceptual Studies, who I admire. She's got excellent credentials and she's very kind. She was instrumental in getting me to even dig deeper, and that eventually led to the book. But it was a very late in life experience and nothing I planned. It was something more experienced than something I sought out.
So that experience of grief, at that point, having that communication, but kind of burying it, it led you on a path, didn't it? I mean, you've really become an advocate for people and
Yes.
creating that podcast. And I know your husband's still around and he empowers you and all those other good things, but the pain of grief. So sending love for that, because that love never
And
dies.
it's grief in a spotlight too, because when you are a homicide survivor, the media descends. And and his was a very public homicide. And the more it's in the news, the more people think they have the right to be intrusive into your life, and they know you and they don't. So it's not only grief, it's grief public. And then you get into the legal arena, and it's displayed in the courtroom. And so, in my situation, and it's not unique, many of my guests will tell you the same thing. In my case, I did not even have a moment to yield to my grief for about 2 years because up until that point in time, you're putting out fires. You're dealing with the media, you're dealing with the logistics of court. In my case, I wanted to physically, geographically move and find a different job. And all of that takes precedent. So there's no time to sit and contemplate. That's like a luxury. And so that all got put on the back burner. And it was a piece by piece kind of thing. And and again, this is not unique to me. The media dug up a lot of stuff that I had no knowledge of. And in my situation, I learned he had led a double life, which had led to his homicide. And he had, I don't want to, you know, be morbid here, but let me just quickly say he wasn't the person I thought he was. And it led me to not want to have any ADCs with him, any after death communication with him. He so shook me. It was so scary and so unnerving and confusing that the thought of having any communication with him would have been rattling. It would have been nightmarish because he was a very different person in real life. And I had no knowledge of that and made me feel rather naive and unhappy with myself for not having seen it sooner.
Aren't we just so tough on ourselves, right?
Yeah,
I really
we are.
trust we human beings do the best we can at the time. And obviously we can't go back, and our other self, younger self, would have done the exact same thing. I just met you for just a few
Yeah.
minutes now, but you're a good, loving, sound person. And we trust as human beings. That's just what we do.
Yep.
So,
And I came from a family like that, you know?
mhm.
I came from a family that says, family is everything. And of course you trust your family. And I had every reason to trust my parents and my life is growing up. So that's what I brought to the marriage. And I didn't question things that he said or did. I just believed him.
Yeah,
And I
why
was
wouldn't you?
18 years younger. That was probably a factor.
So naive. The podcast you created, The Domino Effect of Murder, when you said you got these stories from people, did you start asking, I mean, how did you start prying in? Like, did your whoever contact you from the other side, or did you feel like they did? Did you ask that kind of question?
Well, they always volunteered it. Let me give you an example. I
Okay.
met a very wonderful young woman by the name of Shelley Edwards Jorgensen. She's written a book called Beautiful. Let's see, the Beautiful Fire. I think I got that right. She is phenomenal. And she was 16 when her father murdered her mother. And Beautiful Ashes. That's the name of her book. Beautiful Ashes. And she was only 16 when she knew her father had murdered her mother because he had threatened to do it multiple times and finally made good on it and then burned down the house, which is why the book is called that. And at 16, finally went back to school a couple weeks later. It was at Christmas time, and she was an avid basketball player. She was on the team and she was in the middle of a game and she's dribbling the ball and she's an excellent player, so she could have made the shot easily into the basket. But all of a sudden she looks up and she sees her mother in the stands and she hears her mom's voice saying, I love you and everything will be all right. And she fumbled the shot. Her coach got on her about it. The the break came up. They were in the locker room, and her mother came to her a second time and said, everything will be okay. I love you. And she's having this out of body experience at age 16. And suffice it to say, it was like my situation where she just tucked it away and didn't speak of it. But in my podcast interview of her, she just volunteered that. And I can tell when it comes from their soul, when it's genuine and there's no ulterior motive in talking about it. And so I treated it then as I would now as any delicate piece of communication. And I just validated it for her and drew her out about it and let her speak about it in any depth that she wanted. And she had a lot to say. And in the process, it taught me a lot, that this is a safe topic, that you're not alone, that that was real what happened, and you don't need to hide it anymore. It had to pull it out of me, but it did finally, and I'm at the point now where I just accept it as reality. I mean, it is real, and I wish that my training had brought that into my training so that I could have been better prepared when the moment came and I needed to understand my guests better. And that's why I wrote the book, because I want to fill in the gaps, particularly for people who work in the area of grief. I want grief clinicians to be comfortable with it and knowledgeable about it so that they don't overlook it, or worse yet, pathologize it. That's the last thing a person needs who's had an after death communication experience, is for them to be told, oh, that's of the devil, or that's stress speaking. That's the last thing they need. They need, and I don't care if the grief clinician understands it fully or even accepts it in their own life. That's beside the point. They're there for the benefit of the guest, of the participant. And their role is to validate it, because we know from research again and again that overwhelmingly people who have had after death communication are benefited by it. So why in the world would you take that from them and dilute it? That makes no sense to me at all. And so I've kind of flipped over to the other understanding, and I am an advocate for it. And that's when I started listening to your show. And again, it just reinforces I'm not alone in my thinking. And it's from a lived experience. It's not a researched experience, that I needed to put it all together. Um, and it did. And it's like a rabbit hole. Once you're on it, there's so much more to learn. There's no ending of it. But it's very comforting when I am now with people, and it happens a lot with me, that just tell me spontaneously about their after death. Like the person who does my hair, she was telling me about her and I had told her about the book, and she says, "Oh yeah." She says, "When I was 16, my dad was killed in a motorcycle accident, but when I was 18, it was the first time I went to his grave by myself. And I pulled up and I had the radio on. I turned off my car. It was still sitting in the car. And I had the radio on, and his favorite song came on, which is by the Eagles, called Love Never Dies. And I thought, what a coincidence. Here I am at my dad's grave. The song Love Never Dies comes on by the Eagles. Wow, that's an interesting coincidence. And she was about ready to brush it off when an eagle feather fell on the roof of her car.
Well, that's rare.
That's what yeah, yeah. And she thought, this is more than a coincidence. And she never felt closer to her dad than she did at that moment. I'm impacted by people who tell me these things, and it's not a once in a while thing now. So here we are.
Exactly. It's an all the time thing, and that's what keeps me going as well. Talk about a rabbit hole. I'm in a big
Yes.
one, and I enjoy it
Yes.
because it gives me life, and then I can share with others, and it helps us know that there's a bigger reality. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, something that just triggered this, that a lot of clinicians can think, "Oh, it's just wishful thinking. You want it to be true." And I really do believe that you're sharing your story, Jan, at the perfect time for others in your field or similar can say, "Oh my gosh, this is real." Can you talk about the difference of what ADCs are? They're spontaneous,
Yes.
because there are people, I don't wanna say there are people that have wishful thinking, because there could be a dead bird around the corner, and there could be feathers, and somebody says, "Oh, that's a sign," right? So we gotta be logical a little bit. Not that I would ever say anything to them. But what are after death communications? What are some of the things that stand out about them? And then I wanna get into your book and the different things that you
Okay.
have in there.
After death experiences, as the ones I'm addressing, are spontaneous. They typically happen within the first 2 years of the death of the person. And the individual is not expecting it. Usually they occur later in the day, usually when the person is alone or with a pet. And they don't have a frame of reference for it. But what happens often, regardless of what channel it comes in, visual, auditory, or olfactory, whatever modality it comes to them, A defining feature of it is that it's riveting, unforgettable. It's not a passing thought. It like shakes them to their core. It's attention getting, it's memorable. And to the notion of, well, it's wishful thinking, the reason I don't believe that is because if after death communication is due to wishful thinking, then it should be prevalent in close to 100% of people. And it's not. Research shows again and again that depending on the population surveyed, that after death communications occur in approximately 56 to 88% of the population, not 100%. So, why do we get that? Well, we get that because we have people now finally willing to talk about it in surveys, but many people will only do so if it's anonymous. But if it was that common, if it was 100%, then I think you could chalk it up to wishful thinking, but it isn't. There are people out there that would love nothing more than to have an after death communication, but do not. And how do you explain that if it's wishful thinking? Because they are thinking and they're hopeful, but it doesn't materialize
Right.
yet.
In your book, you talk about 7 forms of spontaneous ADC. What are some of the common ways that people experience this?
Well, it could arrive in any one of the senses, but it's usually a combination. So it might be something where, like in my situation, the one I just explained, it was simply a cognitive, a thought that came out of my mouth. But in many situations, a person can see the individual, and the communication is more telepathic, not like they hear a voice, but they know, they sense. And we experience telepathic communication all the time. I bet every one of your listeners has had the experience where they're driving on the freeway and they know for a fact that somebody is going to cut them off or pull in front of them and they back off. And sure enough, that's telepathic communication. Sometimes it's through olfactory. So a person may smell their cologne or a certain food that the person always cooked, or maybe something associated with their job, like diesel fuel or wood shavings. And it's out of the blue and it catches them off guard. Not always when they're expecting it, like I want to hear from my dad. No, it's more like I'm driving down the road and all of a sudden I get the scent of his cologne next to me or his sweet pipe tobacco. So it can occur in any of the senses and sometimes in combination. And it needn't be the same each time. So one time it could be auditory, another time it could be visual, another time it could be olfactory, or that is the 10 sense of smell. It's not really, you can't really predict how it will happen, but it's very vivid and memorable when it does. It stands out like a sore thumb.
I have a ex-boyfriend who's in spirit. And when I'm busy, it could be editing a podcast, reading a book, something, and all of a sudden I'll get this whoosh, a memory of the 2 of us clear, like on a beach in Mexico or something that we did, complete with the emotion, and it just sneaks in out of the blue. And to me,
Yeah.
that's an after death communication. That's because it's the last thing I'm thinking about, right? So we
Mhm.
pay attention. You talk about this quantum entanglement. Is that what this is, that we're connected with people so we're able to like, this is how this is possible?
I believe it's a factor. I think we're on the edge of understanding it. I think science is on the edge of a paradigm shift. But
Mhm.
quantum entanglement simply states that energy isn't finite, that once connected, always connected. It's not like you pull the plug and there's no connection anymore. And quantum physics demonstrates that there is this ability of energy to not only persist indefinitely, but to connect in ways that we don't yet fully understand, where a change in one entity will have an immediate effect on the other. And when it gets down to it, we are energy. I mean, literally, we are energy. We have enough energy in our brain to run a television, for example, a high definition television.
I
That's
did
why
not know that.
EKGs work. Yeah. That's why electrocardiograms work and EEGs work, because you can see the energy in the brain produced by the nervous system. And so, yeah, I think that energy is going to be the next big thing that we're going to learn about. And as well as I think the next big thing is going to be the study of consciousness and how the brain is more of a receiver of information than a producer of information. There was a book that was written by Eben Alexander, a noted neuroscientist and surgeon, that talks about this. You might be familiar with it after his near death experience. And he's very outspoken on the topic that the brain is really a receiver. And we have, and like when you're cooking and you think of your ex-boyfriend, or when I was at the mirror and I had that, what happens is there are certain moments when the veil is semi-permeable and energy is kind of like tuning in an old radio. If you're in a quiet environment and you get the tuning just right, it picks up a signal. And I think when we're vulnerable, when we're tired, when we're sick, when we're scared, when we're happy, when we're alone, when we're one with nature, those are examples of times when that tuning in can happen and we get the signal better than, let's say, you're driving and there's chaos around you, or you're typing a report for the last minute and everything in your being is focused on the keyboard. That's not going to be conducive. And that's why I think meditation works for some people, is because they're trying to get to that calm state to allow that energy, that twisting of the dial to get that reception best comes in. And when that happens, I think it's ready and waiting. It's just a matter of getting the right environmental cues up, lined up, and your state of mind lined up to be receptive to it.
I love that you talking about consciousness in this because just earlier I was recording an episode and talking about terminal lucidity. The comparison was a radio or a TV. Just because they break does not mean the signal is not there. And the story that I shared earlier today was about a man whose brain was filled with cancer. He lost all everything. He couldn't speak, he couldn't talk to his family. They gave him hours to live. And in the last couple hours of his life, he became fully alert, conscious, spoke with his family, recalled memories, said goodbye, and then he went back to
Yep.
that phase. And doctors can't explain that. I can only
Right.
explain it because our consciousness has to be outside of our body.
Right. Yeah. And what's fascinating about terminal lucidity is it's more likely when the person is not sedated, when is not on pain drugs. So you can't say, well, terminal lucidity is due to pain drugs. It's the opposite is true. It's like when you don't sedate the brain and the receiver is able to receive information, the brain, it will do its job. And as the body shuts down, I think all of that energy is concentrated and able to be there. And voila, you get terminal lucidity. It's fascinating.
We are so much more powerful and miraculous than we could ever imagine. Really.
True.
I always say, things that seem too good to be true, they may not be. I mean, when we're sitting on this planet in an ever expanding universe and down to our quantum level, all we are is invisible vibrating energy. When we start looking through
Mhm.
those lenses, we can say, hey, yeah, energy can't be destroyed. Let's talk about your
Mm.
book a little bit, and then we can talk about some of the things that are in it. It's called Rekindled: Healing Grief Through the Science and Experience of the After Death Communication. Could you run us through what we can find in there?
I wanted it to be accessible and I wanted it to be from experiences. uh, And so, but I also did not want to ignore the science part. I wanted to have a balance to show the scientific underpinnings, but focus on real life examples and pin them together. So in the book, what people would find are things like famous cases of after death communication, like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's very famous for bringing about the stages of grief, right? Well, her experience with Mrs. Schwartz was pretty exciting, and she didn't know what to make of it. And she did what I did. She just shut it down when it happened. Because what happened was Dr. Ross was going into her office and she saw an elderly woman at her office door that she knew had passed away from cancer. And she's like, am I hallucinating? Because I'm seeing Mrs. Schwartz, who looked translucent. but she felt her presence. And so she unlocked her office door, brought her in, and Mrs. Schwartz was telling her, please don't quit your work. Because she was at that point where she was ready to leave her job. She was burned out. Please don't leave your work. That was the message. And Dr. Ross started touching things on her desk to keep her reality focused to say, this isn't reality. I'm having a psychotic break here. And so the scientist in her said to Mrs. Schwartz, would you please write me a note telling me your message? Because she wanted something to preserve that moment. And she said, of course. And so she wrote her the note and she exited the office. And Dr. Ross looked up and down the hallway and didn't see anything. And it never left her. I mean, it's one of those riveting experiences. And she, like me, was like, I ain't talking about this. She didn't talk about that openly for years. So that's in the book. Another slightly off topic, but I think relevant is I don't know if you've covered this with other guests, but the experience of Pam Reynolds in an after, not after death, but a near death experience. That's riveting when you have someone on the operating table who is clinically dead, wired to EEGs and EKGs, and you can see that she's flatlined. They're doing her brain surgery. She pulls through it and afterwards is able to explain what music is on in the surgical room, what the conversation consisted of between the physicians, et cetera, afterwards. And they interviewed her neurosurgeon and asked him, how do you explain this? Because obviously she was clinically dead. You saw it on the monitors. And he wisely said, Dr. Spencer, her surgeon, I have seen so many things in the surgical room that I cannot explain, that I won't begin to say I understand it and can explain it. But I will tell you this, what she said was accurate. The way she described the surgical tools, the conversations that we had, the music that was playing, who was in the lobby, all of that was accurate. And he just sat there in awe, but didn't deny it. So in the book I talk about famous cases and what could possibly explain them. I also talk about the importance of bringing it into grief work if you are a grief clinician and validating it. And I make a point, and I believe this with my whole heart, that until you've read the literature, until you know the names of people doing research in this area, don't be so quick to dismiss it. That as a clinician, you have an ethical obligation to stay abreast of what is out there in research. And it is out there. There's a lot of research. I was guilty of that myself. And so it is your ethical obligation, if you're going to do grief work, to know what the literature says about this before you make up your mind. That's my plea to grief clinicians. That's what they should be doing. Even if they don't wholeheartedly accept it in their heart of hearts, at least have the decency to be familiar with what's out there and then use it and think about it. And it's life changing when you get into it. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but
You're not.
I
There's
believe
people here for the very first time. They have never met me before. They don't know you. So you're not preaching to the choir. Yeah, we've got some loyal fans, but always some first time listeners. So you can
and
keep
I was
sharing.
dragged into this. I didn't want to believe it. I thought it was quackery. I thought it was grief. I thought it was stress. And now I don't. I don't. And it allowed me to 30 some years later go back and revisit my own experience in front of that mirror. And I have no other explanation for it, is to say something reached me from beyond the veil and told me the truth. And I was so worried at that moment in time that I was at a point in time where I was more receptive because I was exhausted. I was worried. The weather was horrible, and I had exhausted all the typical things that you do in terms of calling people and trying to figure out where might he be. I still wasn't prepared for the reality of it when I actually got the details, but that message came from somewhere, and it wasn't something I had even remotely considered before.
Dan, just because someone may not have gotten an after death communication, it doesn't mean that their loved one isn't around them, does it?
No, that's true. And really, I'm of the mind to say that in a fair share of those experiences, they might have missed an after death communication because they can be very subtle, very intuitive. And if you give people the tools to know how to maximize the opportunity and teach them what to look for, what to listen for, what to smell for, it might very well happen. Here's an example. I had a woman I met who kept saying, I wish my husband had sent me an after. I miss him so much. And she said, she wasn't even hearing herself say this. She said, I, especially after his death for the next few days, I sat in his favorite chair holding his portrait when he had my favorite shirt that I gave him on in the picture. And she said, 3 out of the 5 days, a sunbeam came through the window and hit his portrait. And I thought, that's so nice, but didn't think much more of it. Second day it happened. The third day it happened. And then the fourth day did not happen. But she said, I just made him look so content in the picture. And I really liked that shirt I gave. She totally missed the point. And I said, that's an after death communication. He was reaching out to you at that point. It
I had
wasn't
a
coincidence through the first 3 days, and you get the sunbeam every time you sat down. That's communication. It was. And I said, yeah. How did it make you feel? And she said, I felt warm inside, like I had a sunbeam inside of me. And I said, and here you are remembering it days later. And she said, I'll never forget it. I said, that too is an example. It's riveting, it's memorable. You mean that was, I mean, she just couldn't quite wrap her head around the fact that here she'd been assuming all this time that he wasn't reaching out when in fact he was.
I have a story for you. Someone wrote to me not too long ago, wondering if this could be a sign. She said a bird got into her house and the bird landed and stayed on her son's portrait. And then after the bird got out, the bird just every day comes to the windowsill looking in the window. She says, "Could that be a sign?"
You think?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I think for people that would like an after death communication that desires it, maybe it would helps to have them find a quiet place and talk out loud to the person. Let them know I'm wanting, I'm here, I'm able, please show me a sign. I want to hear from you and I will pay attention. And then make and do that a few days in a row and it ups the chances. It's tuning that dial on that radio.
And that's just it. We need to be present. We need to be aware. We are living in such a fast-paced society, waiting
Absolutely.
for the ding
Yes.
on the phone, the email, paying attention to everything going on. We're not in that space. I remember a
No.
man telling me, he's a mechanic, and he said when he's in the zone underneath a car, say, working on it, out of the corner of his eye, he said he kept seeing his father, deceased, and his dog that he had when he was young. And he said it startled him at first, then he would turn and it would disappear. But then when he'd get back into the zone, they were there. So it just gives an idea that we need to do our part, just like you say.
I had an experience not too long ago that I would have totally misread had I not been consuming this kind of information. I very reluctantly, inevitably had to put my St. Bernard down. She had cancer and she had broke her leg and she wasn't going to get better and she was in horrific pain. So I had somebody come to the house to do what she had to do. And it broke my heart because I love that dog. And after she put my dog in her car and started to drive away, and you can see our driveway from my bathroom window. I went into my bathroom and I was sobbing. I was so upset to see her take her last breath. And as I'm standing there watching her drive away and the vet with my dog in the back and knowing that she was in the back of the car, my light went on over my medicine cabinet and then it went out. And had I not been studying this stuff, I would have thought, well, that's an electrical weird thing. But I know better now. That was Heidi talking to me and letting me know that she's still there.
She's
And
still there. She's
eh,
chasing butterflies as a puppy now, and someday in the distant future, that tail will be wagging and running up to greet you.
big old, big old hairy tailors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you like people, whether they're a skeptic or a believer, to take away from reading Rekindled?
I would like them to take away the idea that as you mentioned a minute ago, we are much more than we think we are. Grief is multi-layered, complicated, but we are in a position where we don't have to lament the fact that the person is gone because they're not. Remnants of them exist, and they're they're able to be assessed if we're willing to do it, if we're aware, and it's perfectly fine for us not to accept what we're told as kids coming up that, afterlife doesn't exist in that form that we're told, and wish grief is just an ending. There's so much more out there than we need to make ourselves aware of, and know that if we do have an after death communication, we're not psychotic. It isn't wishful thinking. We don't need it psych meds, but that we are a part of a community of people out there from eons back in time. As a matter of fact, our discouragement about after death communications is really recent. It's only been in the last 150 years, and prior in the United States and North America. Prior to that, it was widely accepted, but only changed with the advent of certain branches of science. And so it's okay for us to dial that research back and realize that science isn't wrong, it's incomplete. And one day it'll catch up. Let's just give it some time.
And there's plenty of good scientists and medical professionals all working on this. Some of the stories I've heard of the verified near death experiences and terminal lucidity and deathbed visitations and after death communications, all coming from scientific minds. There are lots of people working on it. So we just need
Right,
that tipping point to get back to
right,
where it was or even
right.
better.
And I think hospice is leading the way in that area. They do phenomenal work.
Hospice is wonderful. I remember going to wash some clothes at a laundromat, and I noticed the emblem on the lady's shirt. She worked at a hospice, and I thought, do I say something or don't I? And I had written my book at that time, and I just said, "Now, do you have any experiences of people seeing loved ones?" And she just lit up story after story of the wonderful people that join us just before we pass, looking young and healthy, telling us they're going on a trip. I'm not ready to go, but I am comforted knowing that nobody dies alone, that our loved ones are there,
I know.
and even
I
our
I heard
animals.
us. Yeah, all my animals. I want to approach death with curiosity and a sense of this going home that people talk about. I'm curious, and I've led a long life, and I hope I approach it that way when my time comes. I mean, that's my
Yeah.
hope.
Can
We'll
could
see.
you talk a little bit about that ego mind we all have? Because I think it tries to lock us into the here and now. It tries to be skeptical. My personal thought is it's part of being human. I
Mhm.
playfully say it's the game of being human is that we forget who we really are. But can we tone it down a little, Jan? Because sometimes it's really far from being our best friend. It's so degrading, and we wouldn't talk to
Yes,
another person the way we
yes,
talk to ourselves.
yes, yes. We are in a highly competitive world, fast paced. We are not rewarded for intuition. We're not rewarded for uh, being content with ourselves. We're rewarded for achievements and how much material goods we have. That's the game we're in. And so I think in order to get back to who we really are, we need to engage in activities that allow that to bloom. And one of the things that I do that works for me, it's strange as it might sound for some people, especially people from Detroit, where I'm from, is I spend summer nights sleeping in my tent. Night after night, I spend in my garden. My husband, bless his heart, built me a wood platform with treated wood so it won't rot. And I have a 3-person tent that I pitch out there with electricity, by the way, so I can have my phone charger and my heater on, so I can even extend it into November. And I sleep in my tent night after night. And when the weather allows, I have the rain fly off, and I lay there at night and I can hear owls talking to each other, back and forth. I hear coyotes in the distance. I hear rain when, of course, when the rain fly back on. And I look forward to that so much. It's so hard to explain. I think we all need something like that tent in our lives, a place we go to, or a room that we set aside, or meditation that we say to ourselves, where we can just stop and tune everything out, turn off our phones, turn off all the screens, and get back in touch with who we really are and what is really important because we get so busy, we don't get, in fact, I think there are people that go overboard so that they don't get in touch with this, which is sad because that's the way out is to calm that vagus nerve and get in touch with our who we are about what is our importance and what legacy are we building and all those big questions that are just drummed out because our lives are overly scheduled. They're crazy busy and I think getting worse with the advent of the smartphones and we don't have any time for peace. And I love my alone time. Unfortunately, my husband understands that. Bless his heart. He doesn't get in the way of that. I mean, I don't know a lot of guys that would be as understanding as he is about you going to your tent. I go, yeah, okay, see you later. He never comes in. He never asks what I'm doing out there. And it's so peaceful out there. I just love it. And I've set it up in a way that it's really hard to see it. I live on a dead end dirt road in a very, very rural area. My biggest concern is we do have mountain lions out there, but I've studied what to do if I ever ran into one, and I think the odds are pretty small. Um, so my worry isn't people, it's animals. And I've learned how to arrange things so that I can be out there earlier in the spring and later in the fall and extend it into 7 months of the year. And I love it out there. And I think it works for me. It may not work for other people, but I think some having something like that where you can simply count on it to calm down the stimulation and exhale and just think. We don't have that, and I think traveling is another way to do that. I've made it to 5 continents. I've volunteered on 5 different continents and gone to very remote places where there at one place when I was in India, I was there for a month. I didn't even have a bath or a shower. That's how remote it was. No electricity, nothing. And I had a lot of alone time. I've been to Kenya, where I've walked in tall grass and met with shaman and elders, and it's such a fascinating world out there. It is life changing when you come back. You see yourself different. You see your culture different. I've learned so much from people I've traveled with and to see. I've literally been by myself around the world. My husband, again, was very indulgent that way and say, let me know when you're back in the States. And I talk with him on a sat phone, where it's like a pause when you say something and then you wait and then he gets the message and he's able to talk back to you. Because I do photography and it lent itself beautifully with photography. And when I do photography, that's my zone. When I get out in the rainforest and I can get a close up of moss and dew dripping off of cedar leaves and look at animal tracks and see the ocean bubbling up against rocks. Oh, I'm in heaven. It's so far from where I grew up. I-94 and I-75 and Detroit's craziness. I did not know this other world existed till I left, and that's a blessing. So whether you do it through travel or sleeping in a tent or volunteering at hospice, there are so many ways that people can step out of their zone of comfort and be in touch. And I think if people did that, man, that's life altering. I don't know how else to explain it, but I don't want to sound dramatic here, but I try. I'm not always successful, but I try to live in that zone as much as I can. I try to live a calm life. I'm a master gardener. I spend time in my garden. When I went to Guatemala, I said to myself, this is the garden I want when I get home. And it took me years to get it done, but I did. And I've got palm trees out there and gunera, which has leaves the size of, I don't know, 4 feet across. And um, that leads up to my tent. I've had many people when they've been to my house say, I just want to sit in your garden. That's all I want to do is sit in your garden. could you leave me out here? And I go, yeah, I'll bring you a cup of tea later if you want to sit in my garden. But it's accessible if people just use their imagination a little bit and they can make it happen. I firmly believe that. I even think episodes like listening to your show, if they listen to what people have to say in a quiet setting and they can really digest it, that's a break from the hustle and the bustle. Make time for it and it's there. It's right below your nose.
And you're showing us that anything is possible. Dreams can come true. Take a little effort, get out of the comfort zone. That fear can be a killer. And I know some people don't want to
Yes.
feel emotions, but I've got some good medium friends and they teach me how mediumship works. And you start with your feelings. So we don't want to turn off our feelings or avoid them. And it's one of the best
No.
ways our loved ones can communicate with us.
And to piggyback on that, I want to speak just to a second for people who are grieving from a violent death. That growth is possible. You will get to the other side of it. The best thing that you can do is two strong recommendations I make if you have lost somebody to violence is number one, go see your healthcare provider and get some sleep. That's the number one baseline is getting some rest. And secondly, connect with other homicide survivors because they know the language. You'll meet people that have been 20 years down the road that are now facing the parole of the person who did the homicide because it never ends. It's always after another chapter of it. But even an ugly, violent, publicized death is one that does not need to stop your life. You can grow around it. You can learn from it. You can become an advocate to others eventually. And there is support out there for you if you are in this awful, awful learning situation, this steep curve that nobody's prepared for, but it can happen in the blink of an eye. And when it does, please know that you're not alone. You feel like it, but you're not. Go reach out, that there's help out there for you.
Thank you. You're involved with the Innocence Project. Could you tell us what that
I
is?
am. I love the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project is actually a consortium of attorneys working throughout the country who help get people out of prison who are wrongly accused of usually heinous crimes, rape and murder. And it's best done through DNA, but that's not always the case. The most common reason that people get wrongly, there's about 6 reasons. I won't go into all of them, but one of the most common reasons that people get wrongly incarcerated is through faulty eyewitness testimony. What they do is they work hard. They work day and night to get people out of prison who were there and who were wrongly put there, which is critically important because obviously you want the right person incarcerated because they often go out and commit other crimes in the process. And I got involved with them because of a guest on my podcast who was wrongly convicted as a 19-year-old of a homicide of a friend of his. And that's another ripple effect of murder. The domino effect of murder, normally we think of as the grief that comes after, but it can also be your freedom taken. And so he got me to come to an Innocence Project conference, and it was life altering for me. I got to meet people who've been behind bars on death row 30 years, 50 years. They're finally exonerated. Only a tiny proportion of them get exonerated. And I started going to women's meetings, and I discovered that when most women are convicted wrongly of a homicide, it is involving a child in their care. And I met all these women, some have own daycare, some of that was their own children. There's still women on death row that are waiting to be exonerated. There's a case, Melissa Malucio in Texas, rather. Even the FBI and others say she's wrongly in there. She needs to be let out. And the prosecuting attorney won't budge. So I wanted to show up for a couple of reasons. One is I wanted to communicate to the people at the conference. I don't have an axe to grind. I don't have skin in the game. I don't know anybody personally who's been put in and incarcerated because of murder. But I'm here as a crime victim saying I want you to be let out. That because homicide survivors as a group, when they get into the courtroom, particularly if there's been a confession, want blood. They're not open to the possibility of innocence. They don't believe in such a thing as a forced coercion of a confession, but it happens. And so when I have opportunities to speak with other homicide survivors, I want them to leave open the door for the possibility that this person could be innocent. And I don't want the wrong, there's a book out called Given Life, and it's about a homicide survivor who was wrongly incarcerated for the murder of his wife. Michael Morton is the author's name. And he spent 20 years in a Texas prison for the murder of his wife that he did not do. And I tell them, you don't want that. I don't want that. And the only ways and there are many ways we could fix the system if we're just open to it. Uh, so I think it's an extension of where I'm at because I think that there's this disconnect between crime victims and people who have been wrongly accused. And I don't think that's healthy. I think we need to build a bridge there and to say, yes, I want somebody who's murdered my loved one to be incarcerated, but I want to make sure it's the right person. I don't want, even if there's been a confession, I want to know if it was coerced. And there are ways that we can figure that one out too. We just don't have the will to do it. So it's a way of expanding my lived experience, not just to other homicide survivors, but to detectives, to prosecuting attorneys, to say, hey, I'm a voice too. And I'm coming to you as a crime victim saying, we want to correct this system. I'm speaking on behalf of those who've been incarcerated. And they look at me like, why do you care? Because I'm a citizen and it's taxpayers' money's wasted. And because it's not moral. And there's lots of reasons why. But the Innocence Project does wonderful work, often through volunteers that give of their time, investigators, attorneys, um, people who are doing the typing and putting on the conference. And when you sit and you hear story after story of people who had their lives turned upside down because of wrongful eyewitness testimony or bogus science, it is chilling. It is chilling. And it impacted me personally because when I went into those women's meetings, I learned, as I said, that the most common reason women are wrongly accused, it is usually the woman is Black, she has a child in her care, and she has no attorney. And premature decisions are made. And I got to thinking about my own life situation. I adopted 2 Black daughters, and my grandchild was born. And when she was 2, she kept fainting and she was losing weight. And my daughter would take her doctor after doctor, and she was getting bruised from falling. And the doctors were asking her, why is your child bruised? And that would go in the notes. And finally, somebody put a tape measure around my granddaughter's head and said to my daughter, a nurse did this, and said to my daughter, go right to Children's Hospital. Do not go home. I'm calling ahead. They'll be waiting for you. This is an emergency. And she had a brain tumor that had been undiagnosed for 18 months, and her brain was swelling. And the neurosurgeon thought it was serious enough that they brought her in on Thanksgiving morning to do the surgery and saved her life. 2 more weeks later, and she would have been dead, he said. And I got to thinking, and I asked one of the women at this conference, my daughter's Black, her baby was bruised. If she had died in her sleep, which is what the neurosurgeon said would have happened in 2 more weeks, is that the kind of scenario where my daughter could have been wrongly accused of homicide? They said that is textbook. So it really impacted me personally. And I told my daughter, hear my words. If anything like this should happen to you, the first words out of your mouth is, I want an attorney. Because prosecutors want convictions. And you and I are not sophisticated in the law. And a baby who's dead can't speak for itself. And there's women right now on death row who are in those shoes. And I hope they get out. But the Innocence Project is a very important organization. And I am privileged to be a part of their conferences. There's one coming up again in Chicago in April, and I'll be there.
Jan, you're an incredible woman. You've opened up so much. And
Thank you.
for our listener or our viewer, in my heart, everything that I do is a foundation of helping people through grief. It truly is proving that our love goes on, that our loved ones are still around. And then it just opens us up to who are we and what is our life for? So you're hearing from one representative that is really getting her money's worth out of this life and doing, being of service and sharing. Jan, your website is jancantyphd.com. What can we find there?
Well, you'll find that I'm helping host the first ever conference for homicide survivors next year in Gig Harbor, Washington. That will be happening on 9/11, and I chose that date specifically because it is my belief that we were all homicide survivors that day on 9/11, if we're old enough to remember it. I know we're getting away from that date-wise, but if you remember back to how you felt the first 5 minutes before you could turn on the news and or get the full picture when you just heard about it, how did you feel when you knew those planes that struck the building? That's what a homicide survivor experiences, that disbelief and confusion and need for information. So I chose that date particularly for that. And they'll find information there about the conference. I have some phenomenal speakers lined up. I have one, the lead speaker will be a former prosecuting attorney who does now nothing but represent victims in court, victims of crime. And I have another woman coming. She's coming from Canada, Alberta. Her name is Billy Heavyshield. She is of the Kenai Bloodfoot Nation. She's going to be speaking about the missing, the MMIW, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls movement, or not, a tragedy, which she's trying to draw more attention to, which we need to hear more about. And we're going to have a panel discussion. We're going to have a resource room where some of our members can bring their books. I have another one that's going to be talking about her brand new podcast that she just started for homicide survivors. She's going to have a booth. There's going to be somebody there who's going to be talking about post conviction communication and the advantages and risks involved in structured conversations with the accused. Well, not the accused, with the convicted. So it's that's going to be on there. Registration just opened. They'll find information about my books, and I have a pretty extensive blog on there that I try to keep fresh and that talks about all different things related to grief. It's geared more towards people who experience violent death, but it not exclusively. So things about the impact on the jury or the importance of sleep or why people say things that hurt your feelings, not intending to do that and what you can do. Um, the importance of attending to your physical health, on and on. They can find that information there. And some about different podcasts I've been on.
Jan, thank you from all of us for being our guest today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity and for the work that you do. It's important, and I'm glad that you are listened to so widely because the messages that people hear from you and from your guests are very important. And I think it's a great platform for people to tune in and just put everything aside and get their vibrations up.
Thank you for that. There's definitely a ripple effect. There's going to be people that listen to this episode and something strikes a chord and they'll go on to search and explore, and whether it's after death communications or anything that we've talked about today, that's what we're here for, just to help plant the seed. So we
Yep,
thank
yep.
Dr. Jan Canty. Her website, of course, is jancantyphd.com. Her book is called Rekindled: Healing Grief Through the Science and Experience of After Death Communication. I also want to thank you, our listener or our viewer, for taking the time to be with us today. Oh gosh, there was so much here for us in this one conversation, but your time is precious. And I really thank you for spending it with us today. As a
Thank you
reminder,
for giving me your time.
oh, you are so most welcome. And as a reminder, 2 o'clock New York time every Sunday, got to do the math where you are in the world. I offer a free Sunday gathering, non-denominational, empowering and inspirational service on Zoom. It is the coolest thing ever, with music and good conversation. And of course, there's a medium demonstration in each and every one. So we get loved ones from all over the world reconnecting, and we get to see how close our loved ones are and that they're still part of our life. So lots to explore at we don't die.com. That's there for you. In closing, my name is Sandra Champlain. I'm always so happy that I get to be your host on We Don't Die. I do believe that life is an education for the soul and that your life here on earth is important. And no matter what's happened to you in the past, it is an opportunity to grow and to learn and to share and to make a difference. And if you're going through a really tough time, there are absolutely resources for you. And don't be surprised if someday you look back and you say, oh my gosh, that thing happened. And this is where I am now. And I'm talking to this person. They needed to hear my words. Miracles happen, my friends. So, with that, I really want to thank you for listening or for watching, and we'll see you again soon.